Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
We're actually looking at the ways in which, at least in the rabbinic mind, in the Talmudic mind, the connections between these two sort of life cycle moments go beyond just, the fact that they both have the number 7 in them. In fact, in the Talmud, there's a whole conversation about the 7 days of blessing. They said, you need a minyan for the Birkat Chatanim, the Sheva Brachot, for each of the 7 days after the wedding. And similarly, you need a minyan for Birkat Avelim, the blessing of the mourners, which is not the mourner's Kaddish. And so the rabbis in the Talmud sort of say, what is this Birkat Avelim that we're talking about? And the idea of for 7 days we say this blessing, and it goes through this ritual which we sort of lost over time. But it's actually, and maybe we can think about some of the reasons why. But it was actually kind of a beautiful ritual. It brings the story of Reish Lakish, the great rabbi, going to, a friend of his, someone who taught his children.
His son's teacher.
His son's teacher. He goes to his son's teacher's house on the second day after the funeral, because, right, same idea with Sheva Brachot, you need the panim charashot, you need the new faces in order to say the blessings. There's a similar idea, I guess, with Shiva, that they would only say this if there were new people in the house. And he started reciting this set of blessings that were kind of parallel to the Sheva Brachot, but they were all about mourning. Instead of being about celebration and unification of a husband and wife, it was all about God who comforts the mourners and revives the dead, and takes care of similar things, takes care of the community's needs and so forth. And I think it's actually sort of this beautiful parallelism that exists in Jewish tradition, in which we see in these episodes, right? We're sort of simultaneously dealing in grief and in joy, in Shiva and in Sheva Brachot. And that started last episode and continued in this episode. But I think even in the Jewish tradition, it's stronger than that. There's really this, they're almost, mirror images of one another, these two processes. In the same way that there's sort of at a funeral is this incredibly sad experience. And then there's a transition gradually from, the incredible sadness of the funeral to the Shiva, which is still very sad, but, you're beginning to sort of get accustomed to this new way of living, then into the Shloshim and then into the full year. There's actually the same thing when it comes to weddings, that there's sort of the wedding, there's the celebration, and then there's the Sheva Brachot, the 7 days of feasting, as it were, and kind of getting used to this new way of living. And then into the whole first year has its own special significance. So I think the episode is sort of playing on that in a really interesting way, that, sort of touching on this Talmudic connection between. One thing I was thinking about is the way, why it is that we've changed the nature of Shiva so much. And I think we'll mostly be talking about Shiva today, though if people want to talk about Shiva, we can as well. But when we were reading the stories earlier of Reish Lakish going to this person's house and saying all these blessings, saying I can't imagine someone's making a recite all of these blessings of gratitude for God who, comforts the mourners and so forth, especially in this case with someone who had lost a child. It was saying Baruch Dayan Hamet, blesses the true judge, is hard enough for people. And in the, as much as we've sort of held on to those rituals as described and those blessings as described for the wedding, and thinking about the ways that God is really present in that experience, we've kind of removed the theodicy piece when it comes to death in certain ways, that the idea of blessing God, we're supposed to bless God for the good and for the bad, but it's much harder to bless God for the bad. And I think that, might play into why Shiva just becomes such an awkward experience. And like, what do you say, which is so much of a topic of this episode. Rabbi Schatz, do you want to add to that?
I just feel like we all have to like take a deep breath. That was such a deep soliloquy you just had.
Long soliloquy.
I think that based on this episode, the way that Rabbi Pernick and I got to this topic was because one of the main moments that kind of starts off the episode and then comes back at the end of the episode is, in this time of real joy, are we even allowed to go to our very good friend's home for Shiva? And I thought I knew the answer, and I was glad that I was right at the end of the episode. It's always good when, actors who know nothing about halacha can verify the halacha that you learned in rabbinical school. And it is an interesting thing to think about, that if you're in your own week of Sheva Brachot, and I just want to make sure that this is clear because I'm not sure that it is for everybody. Sheva Brachot are not just what you say under the chuppah, with usually beautiful singing and sometimes even people, I was talking about this to the other Rabbi Pernick, that sometimes even other people will bring up, beautiful interpretations or translations or whatever as a way of giving an honor to the couple. But that there's also this week that follows the wedding, that follows the chuppah, called Sheva Brachot, and you're supposed to have new people come, and usually there's a way of coordinating so that you do have new people in your home every day, throughout the week, and you say the Sheva Brachot at the end, just like you would at the end of the Suda Mitzvah of a wedding. So anyway, all of that being said, it's interesting that instead of having people over to their home that evening, they go to a Shiva home, right? That there's really a very distinct difference there of what they should be doing versus what they end up doing. And so I agree with like the weightiness of imagining that as a moment in your life, but also being able to just think about how we show up for people, even if it's not the way that we expect to be behaving after our wedding, that if something were to be bothering or occurring in our friends' lives, that hopefully we would try to show up for them and be there in a way that would be supportive of them and put our own piece aside. The only thing I was going to mention about the God piece, which was much deeper than I had originally thought about this topic, is that for people, sometimes Kaddish is also difficult, right? Because Kaddish are these words that have nothing to do with mourning and nothing to do with the grief you're feeling and the anger you might feel towards God. And all of a sudden you're saying, wow, God, you are so great. Thank you so much. I actually, as a practice, try to not say Baruch Dayan Amet because it is a hard thing to hear and it is a hard thing to say. And I think that is brought up a little bit in this episode as well with the longer sentence of Hamakom Yenachem, and just the ways in which we try to choreograph moments of grief to make it easier on the mourner, but also, as Rabbi Pernick was just saying, like less awkward for the person who's supposed to be giving that comfort and support. So those are the three things I want to add. Anyone have any thoughts about those moments in Rebecca or Leonard?
I have kind of the flip side, a pseudo hypothetical question. My cousin was getting married in Minneapolis and we came for the wedding and I was supposed to recite one of the Sheva Brachot at the wedding ceremony. And my mother passed away the day before. So instead of going to the wedding on Sunday morning, we got on a flight from Minneapolis back to LA because my mother had passed away. So I didn't end up going to the wedding, but would it have been appropriate for me to go to the wedding, not the reception, but the wedding, let alone say a Sheva Brachot? I mean, I wasn't quite in mourning yet, right? My mother hadn't been buried, but I just wonder about that sometimes.
I don't remember reading about Sheva Brachot as one of the categories of things that falls in like that period of aninut, of right, like you haven't yet buried the person yet, so you're not yet a mourner. Maybe Rabbi Pernick remembers. I don't believe that Sheva Brachot is one of those categories. Do you know?
Yeah, that's what I mean. So I just wanted to see your answer. See what happens,
go ahead, whatever.
Well, so actually, it's interesting. So what you did is the correct thing to do in that case. The idea is that once, if a parent passes away, sort of like we're seeing with Nachi's trying to, like, in the last episode, avoid the situation because he's just like, if I turn my phone off and don't hear anything about my mom, I could take part in the simcha and just, like, and eventually it becomes impossible. Was actually so the Talmud talks about what happens in a case where someone, there's one of the members of the couple loses their parent the day of the wedding. So it says, in the case where, like, everything is all prepared, everything is all ready, and then one of the parents of one of the, the members of the couple passes away, what do they do? And it says there, and it's actually, it's an interesting idea, and I guess kind of what makes the most sense. It says, they remove the person who passed away, they remove the body to somewhere else. They do the wedding, they do yichud, and then they actually do the 7 days of Sheva Brachot, and then immediately following the 7 days with Sheva Brachot, they sit Shiva. But during that period, they're not together at night. The couple isn't. They sleep separately, and that was actually, it's the same part of the Talmud that talks a lot. We spoke last week about chupat nida. What happens when the bride is in nida, and it's actually the same. That conversation from last week was a sort of addendum to this conversation about what happens if one of them is in mourning. So for one of, if it's one of the members of the couple who loses a parent, then it's a much more complicated thing because you actually are sort of like involved in this, in the wedding. If you're someone who's reciting a blessing, or you're an aide or a witness or something like that, I think what you did is the correct thing to do. Just, something where if you're the bride, you can't replace yourself. But if you're another role in the wedding, you can find a replacement, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do.
But I don't think, just to go back to my response, I don't think that there's anything that says you cannot do Sheva Brachot, right? Which is what I was trying to get at. That I don't. Right, Pernick is right. Like, your reaction to the moment was the right thing to do because it was the right thing for you, right? Like, that's also the most important part. Is doesn't matter what it says in halacha. That was the right thing for you to do, and so you went. But I don't believe that there are categories of things that you are not supposed to do or you are supposed to do in that kind of limbo period between person dying and person being buried. And I don't believe that Sheva Brachot is mentioned as one of those things. And so you would make that judgment call based on how you felt about being there, knowing that your mother had passed and not, having yet buried her, but making sure that you could get everything you needed together and all of that before that happened.
You don't recite blessings when you're in Aninut. So
I know, but that's what I was saying. Like, I don't know that Sheva Brachot, because if she wasn't, no, I know it's a blessing, but is it in that same kind of category of blessing? It's not a blessing that you would be saying. It's not like
you're saying on behalf of the community, not for yourself.
Right, exactly. I don't know.
Okay, I see a couple hands. So I think Denise's hand was up first. So maybe Denise and then Renee.
So my father passed away on Hanukkah, but it was also Christmas Eve. So I ended up being like in that in-between zone for several days, because then it was like Christmas Eve, then it was Christmas, then it was Shabbat, and it was December, and it was whatever. So there was like several days. So I got to really know those rules about the in-between zone. And it was like, and so we weren't supposed to do any positive mitzvahs, is what they told me. So like, I couldn't light the Hanukkah candles. I couldn't say halal when it was Rosh Chodesh. Couldn't say any blessings over food. And it was kind of neat, actually, because it made me feel very close to God, because I was aware of being so thankful all over the place and not being able to say anything. And if I was able to just, say a bracha and keep going. I wouldn't have noticed at all. So it was kind of an interesting experience.
It's very interesting. Yeah. I was looking, we have a WhatsApp group for questions to my Rosh Shiva, the head of rabbinical school. And someone just asked one the other day, talking about, someone whose family member is getting buried in a military cemetery. And, they passed away 2 days ago and the funeral is scheduled for like 3 weeks from now.
Oh my God.
And that was the question, is like, what do you do with aninut? Like, are they just an onen for like weeks? And they said there's no way of changing it. That's like the way they schedule these at the military cemeteries. That comes up, and usually it's not for so long, but I think the way you're describing feeling it is a really interesting thing, that you actually provided a avenue for connection.
Yeah.
With COVID, I don't know about in Louisiana, but in California, it's the way that a lot of burials are happening here too, that people can wait up to 3 weeks to have their loved one buried. The Jewish cemeteries are a little bit more careful in terms of trying to get it earlier than that, but I know people who have been buried 2 weeks after they've died. And it's a really hard period of time, but as you're saying, knowing what it is that you can also let go of during that time is comforting, right? It's helpful. Okay, Renee and someone else I think had their hand up, but Renee.
So I was wondering if what you were saying in terms of them, whether the Chassan Kala going to the Shiva, if it could have been, if it's a situation like where, like when people have to go to a simcha and it's during like Shloshim or even during the year, that there are arrangements that are made where they work at the simcha as opposed to, so they're not coming out as an actual guest, but they do work. So if they had gone to the Shiva and let's say prepared a meal or served them a meal while they were there at the Shiva, would that have been more acceptable, or does it not, or what they did okay anyway?
What they did is okay anyway, but an interesting question. I don't know if it goes that, like you're talking about the opposite situation, right? Where like Nati was then going, like the mourner is doing something joyous rather than the opposite.
Right.
Situation going to something sad. I'd have to think about that. I mean, what they did was fine, but I would have to think about if it could also go the reverse.
That someone who's celebrating shouldn't go to a Shiva.
Yeah, where they were supposed to be, like you said, in the week of Sheva Brachot and doing something happy, and they obviously couldn't or chose not to because they wanted to support their friend also.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I loved the idea that the episode was called Panim Chadashot, which means new faces, which in the Gemara that Rabbi Pernick was referring to, which I know not everybody learned with him, they talk about Panim Chadashot both for Shiva and for Sheva Brachot. It's like Shloshim, but SHs, it's really very difficult. And it's interesting that those new faces are used for different types of moments in both places, right? That you need to have that community around you. You can't have your same cadre of friends show up for you every single night. You need to have other people take responsibility of showing you that support and showing you that comfort in both ways, right? Both for the very happy, joyous moments and also for the moments that are harder to be present for. Norm.
Just one quick point before we get to Norm. Because I just looked at the WhatsApp thing about the aninut, and there was like actually a lot of comments on it because everyone's dealing with it. And they basically said that, Rav Linzer said there is a middle state where if you've already done everything you can do for the funeral, then you're not an onen anymore. You sort of leave the status of aninut, but you haven't begun avelut. You don't begin mourning until the funeral. So there's sort of this limbo state where you can say blessings, you can daven, you can't sit Shiva. So it's like that, it's like really complicated middle ground.
You go back to your normal human state rather than being an onen or being
you're just in this weird middle, like regular human state, because you're not an onen and you're not an avil. So it's like, okay, Norm.
I had two questions. One is, you said something about there would be a period when they wouldn't be sleeping together. And it seems to me that during the Sheva Brachos period, if the bride was a virgin, they would then not be sleeping together for the whole week, which is part of the reason that there is Sheva Brachos. They do celebrating every night instead of intercourse.
Because she would have bled. I've got to be
presumably.
So here's this is the Gemara in Ketubot. It says, right, if one's bread was baked and his animal slaughtered and his wine diluted and he placed water on the meat, meaning he's done all of the preparations for the wedding, and the father of the groom or the mother of the bride died, one moves the corpse into a room, and the bride and groom are ushered to the wedding canopy, to the chuppah, and they're married. The groom then engages in intercourse with the bride to fulfill the mitzvah, and he then withdraws from his wife's wife, and the corpse is buried. And they then observe the 7 days of the wedding feast, and thereafter observe 7 days of mourning. And throughout those days of feast and mourning, the groom sleeps among the men and the wife sleeps among the women, and they're not permitted to be alone together. And then it continues by talking about the chuppah. So it's it's different because in this case they actually have consummated the marriage, whereas in the case we talked about last week they haven't consummated. Here they have consummated the marriage, and we were talking a little bit earlier about why is it that they, with a regular couple who's been married for years and one of them loses a parent, there's no issue. They're not supposed to sleep together, but they're not forbidden from being in the same place. But in this case, for that first week, they're told to sleep separately. And I think it actually might be something about sort of the simcha, the joy, is also obviously the newness and the excitement around the wedding and so forth, that we say sort of you should sleep in different places after that first night so that you're not tempted to have sex again because you're pseudo in mourning, even though you're also in celebration.
But they did not consummate their marriage.
Right, because they were a chupat nida case, right? So the reason that this comes up is because it then goes straight into, in this same part of the Gemara, it goes straight into the case that we talked about last week, which is, and here's another reason that you wouldn't sleep with your, person after the wedding. So they're using this as a way into that piece.
Right, but it kind of normalizes their situation because if they had consummated the marriage, they wouldn't be touching each other anyways.
True, except for no one, thank God, died on their sides, right? So we're dealing with a lot of different things that really nicely came together. I'm sure that the writers of Srugim knew.
Just saw the sugya and they're like, we're just taking the sugya and we're making it.
They put the sugya together in 2 different episodes. But earlier I was talking to Rabbi Pernick about how I thought that it would be bizarre to not allow the bride and groom to be together, to be able to sleep together throughout that week, because if they've already been allowed to consummate the marriage, we know that it's not because of nida that they can't be together for the rest of the week. Yes, and so, do you want to say something?
I think it is. It's because at least in a first marriage, if the bride is a virgin and she bleeds, she's then forbidden to him for the next period of time.
12 days, yeah.
At least when I first learned about it, that was given as the reason for having Sheva Brachos. It gave them something to do every night.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
My theory, but I think that there's something about not being able to be with a person who would potentially bring you comfort. And when I think about it more, if you think back in these times of the Gemara where they would have met their betrothed, a week or 2 or 3 before they got married, and they don't actually know the person, this actually might be a way in which they can return to their family's home to find comfort with the people who they actually know. Because if they're being told to stay with their husband or wife, then they're not allowed to touch, right? There's something there that is less comforting during a time that your parent died than if you were allowed to go back to your childhood home and be with siblings and aunts and uncles and the other parent, ostensibly, in this case. So I'm less concerned about the nida thing and more concerned about the idea that this might have actually been a way for someone to find comfort in a moment where it would have been, again, awkward and unknown how to find that comfort. Potentially.
Okay, Robert. I'm going to have Robert, he's had his hand up.
Okay, well, stepping away from the religious implications, etc. the title of the episode, Panim Chadashot. So actually, there's several new faces on the characters. The only one that is mixed up is Nazi because he's it seems like he's mixed up. However, you have Ruth coming back from India, and everybody expects her to have a new face, and she doesn't. And then you have Yafat and her partner. Anyway, they have new faces since they're newly married, and they don't know how to face each other that well. They're trying to figure out some of the interaction. And then you have the newly non-religious one with her new face, and people doesn't know. So the title of the episode, I think, has a lot to do with the stage in the character's development.
You're right. There's a lot of sort of new faces in that way. But you're right. It's an interesting point that Re'ut is the one who everyone's like, oh, what's new? And she's like, no, I didn't really do it.
And it's not so hot,
Right.
What's hot, but it's not,
That also brings up, and this is not what Robert was just talking about, but I'm going to just use it as a segue. That brings up an interesting moment in the episode also where when you're sitting Shiva, you're not supposed to be the one you are supposed to be the one who initiates conversation. You're not supposed to assume that someone else is going to approach you and ask you how you're doing, right? The halacha is actually, and this is one of the more awkward things that people don't do well, but maybe sometimes should do better, which is be quiet until the mourner speaks to you. And when Re'ut goes out to the brother who we all like, whatever his name is, guess we don't like him that much. Anyway, she goes out and she's really able to have the first real conversation. And yet in doing that, she's kind of going beyond the bounds of what you're supposed to do in a Shiva home. Roe, thank you. Very good. So I thought that was very interesting also, and how the show plays out those pieces of halacha, which she shouldn't have started the conversation. Sorry. Yeah, she shouldn't. I keep forgetting who's the mourner. In terms of like allowing him the space to bring up wanting to know about her trip or whatever, and she's the one who opens it up, and we see how that continues to play out in the episode. Rebecca or Leonard, that box.
Hi. I don't know, now that we've transitioned, I don't know, I still had to comment on what we were talking about before.
Okay. That was my bad. Go back.
On the Ani Newt. My mother passed away on the third day of Sukkot. And so she was buried during Sukkot, but I was told the mourning period didn't start until after Simchas Torah. And to me, it felt like the rabbis just got it wrong completely, that here I'm supposed to be joyous with the Torah on Simchas Torah, and then I can start mourning the next day.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's similar to what we were talking about with this idea of, in that case where someone's parent dies the day of the wedding, get married, have Sheva Brachot, and then mourn. Like, what happens during those 7 days of quote-unquote celebration? Like, that's just a weird time. And yes, theoretically, you're supposed to be happy. It's Sukkot is man simchatenu, right? It's the time of our happiness, but it's not happy. But you're supposed to pretend to be happy. Like, you're totally right experientially. And I think that's an experience that many people who lose a loved one on or immediately approaching a chag feel. There's like that loss and that for people who lose a loved one right before a chag, it's a different kind of loss of you just don't get to sit Shiva. So I guess with you, at least you got to do the morning practices. It was just delayed. But, I think the idea behind it is that they don't, on the rabbi's end, in some ways, it's actually more about the community than the mourner in that case. That if during this celebratory time, people are going to visit the Sheva house, it diminishes their joy. And so sort of we're just going to sorry, mourner, we're going to put you on hold until we community are no longer in celebratory. But
is that the right thing to do?
Really
but is that the right thing to do? to a person you supposedly care about?
So that's a good question, right? Is that the right thing to do? So that's kind of what we do, but it's certainly difficult on the mourner. I think it's also difficult on the community members who want to mourn with that person, even if like this is halachically happy time. Like, you know, if you're feeling that loss, you're feeling that loss. So it's a tough one.
There are also ways in which we get around this type of halacha, even in extreme halachic movements, in terms of like there are certain times during the year that you're also not supposed to eulogize, right? And I've never been to a funeral where the rabbi says, oh, and sorry, you know, it's such and such a time on the Jewish calendar, we're not going to say a eulogy. You get around it by saying
that exact thing. We don't say eulogies on this time, so I'm not going to eulogize, and instead I'm going to say what. Right.
Or use it as like a teaching moment to be able to explain why you wouldn't, but the reasons that we are going to, you know, and then you continue ahead with a eulogy. And it's a little bit of a stretch, but I would go as far as to say that right now in my community, we are saying Kaddish for exactly the same reasons, even if we're not saying anything else during a minyan that requires a minyan, right? So we're not doing the Amidah aloud. We're not saying Baruch Hu. We're not doing any of the category of things called Dvarim Shebikdusha that would need a minyan. And one of the reasons we will do Kaddish is because we believe, for the same reasons that you would say a eulogy on a day where you're not supposed to, or you would come up with ways that you could comfort a mourner even if the person dies right before Yom Kippur and it stops short because there's a holiday coming up, that you find ways to bring comfort to the person through the community. And right now in COVID, that's allowing a person who started saying Kaddish before this time, or who loses a person during this time, to say the words that they would expect to say if they had lost somebody. And I know that's not happening everywhere, but that's happening in our shul, and it's for very similar reasons. Rachel or Norm?
Rachel is posting something, and I wanted to say that I wanted to ask about that line they kept on doing at the Shiva. I'm very much accustomed to saying Yenachem Eschem B'Soch Shari Avilatzin V'Rushalayim, but there was another sentence after that. Almost everybody had it.
Velotosifu something.
But you should know an end to sorrow in English.
Yeah. It's Velotosifu something. I forget the third. And that was even what they were asking. Like, Rudy was asking, like, what's that last part of it? What's those last couple of words? Because you're right. A lot of people don't say it. Probably most people don't say it. But there is.
It seemed like almost everybody was saying it. I thought maybe it's an Israeli custom, but I don't know.
It is said in Yiddish, by the way, when people where Yiddish is their natural language, and then they go to a shiva like that, they do say that.
What do they say in Yiddish?
What do they say? Sollst du nicht wissen mehr von Tzuras.
Oh, okay. You shouldn't know from Tzuras.
See, that is going to be easier to remember.
Yeah, really.
It's also interesting that.
Thank you.
That the I tried to look it up, by the way, Norm, and I can't find it quickly, but I'll try to find it in Hebrew quickly.
I'll be able to use the Yiddish. That's fine.
Oh, great. Okay. I won't, so I'll look it up for me. But the way that every person also says hamakom, right? For some people, that's a custom that they still do. And for others, you would say it as a community facing towards the mourner, and not say it individually, like as you're leaving the home. And it's interesting because Hamakom Yenachem is plural, right? So when you're talking to one person and looking at them in the face and saying these words, it's an interesting line to say when it's to that one person. I'm not going to give a drash on why it's plural. Many of you have actually heard me do that, so I'm not going to do it again. But it is an interesting practice to see that the person individually recite it, as opposed to it being something that is said kind of communally for the person, even if it's not a whole group. Yeah, Renee.
And among the Israeli cohorts that I'm involved with, they just say "Shelo tidi yoter mitza'av."
Right.
Mm-hmm. And
they don't even deal with the hamakom yenachem.
Well, if you noticed, Amir didn't say hamakom yenachem. He said mina shamayim, whatever the Sephardi version, mina shamayim tinichamu or something like that. I think I forget how it's grammatically constructed, but may you be tinichamu, like may you be blessed from, may you be comforted from on high, which is much shorter, and it's kind of, it also doesn't say God, right? Mina shamayim tinichamu, may you be comforted from on high, is like, it's a much less awkward phrase. So yeah, that's
Idan.
Wait, Renee, were you saying something? It sounded like you started. Oh. Okay. Yeah, so you're right. It's and then people are always like trying to make sure like they're practicing beforehand, especially people who haven't been to Shivas, and there's like a sign there, and they're practicing hamakom, like it's like an awkward thing. And like, yeah, I actually often won't say it because like when I'm leaving a Shiva, because it's so awkward. So, I don't know. I think it's better to say something. Tinu chamu. I was close. Tinu chamu. Thank you, Dad. It's my. I said tinu. Yeah, that's.
Your pocket grammarian. But Nati did not want to hear hamakom one more time. Maybe Amir knew. Yeah.
But also, that's Amir's custom. He's sorry. That's his custom anyway, right?
But also, like, there was something very interesting about Amir's interaction with Nati that no one else really picked up on, which was being there, and interesting that he's the groom, right? So had he not been there, it's possible Nati wouldn't have actually have felt as comforted by anybody who would have visited him. He was able to really open up with Amir in a different way than anybody else who came to visit. Yeah. Did anybody else pick up on anything in the episode that you want to reference before we?
Amir and Nati have been like housemates and best friends
for a long time.
The series presents it as if ever since Amir's divorce, be that 1 year, 2 years, whatever, that they have shared a house together. And so it's kind of like, of course, Amir would be Nati's friend.
For sure. Yeah. Denise.
Okay, so two things, both Nati related. One was, I thought was an interesting writer's choice. He works at Hadassah Hospital, and his mother is Hadassah. And, she could be named anything.
Yeah.
So that seemed intentional. And then, because there's a sign of Shiva for Hadassah burner. And then also, I felt like Nati really grew a lot in the episode. And that he's been growing for a while. Like when he was talking with the brother, and Nati's been there every day except for the last day. And then the brother says to him, you know what she said right before Shema? She said, "Where's Nati?" And like Nati takes it as a sting, and I took it first as a sting. But then later when he said, "I'm jealous of you," it almost felt like Nati is the one that the mother counted on, and that, you know what I mean? And that like, that the brother and maybe the other siblings too felt like in her eyes, he was the top one and they were like all kind of second best. And that was a new awareness for Nati. So like, I think he feels really guilty to tell people why he wasn't there. I don't know. I feel like Natis are people too. Like I think he gets a tough rap, but I think he has a lot of goodness in him.
Yeah, I think even the telling the story is sort of like he sees the way that people are responding to his brother. I mean, and you see Nati in a number of ways. You see him racing ahead with Kaddish, right? There's sort of like the ways that he's kind of like, so everyone is volunteering for a Shabbos to take care of their dad, and he doesn't. Like there's sort of these ways, but it clearly is coming from a guilt place, right? I think it seems to me very clear that he's feeling very guilty about the fact that he wasn't there primarily. And,
he's also the one who's been there every day. right? He says he was there every single day. And
Though
the
he
other
also
ones
worked there
weren't.
every day.
So like, yeah, they could do a Shabbos here and there. And,
right.
And maybe he just recognizes that he's spent. And like he said, he's not even there half the time.
Right. So, yeah, no, I mean, I think
very
it's interesting.
generous tonight.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. No.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, I think Nati's in a he's feeling guilty for all of this. I think he's lashing out because of this feeling of guilt. And yeah, I mean, he does roll his eyes when Rory tells the story, but it's because of the fact that he wasn't there. Right? It's not like that. I mean, he's getting so annoyed by the fact that his brother's telling it, but it's because his brother has this beautiful story that he can't tell because he wasn't there. And so eventually he says, you know what, I'm just telling the story as if I was there. Right? Like,
yeah. But he also, he feels guilty, but, a more calculating person would find a way to work it in and say, hey, I was there, and 3 weeks ago she did this, and 5 days later she did that. Right. And he doesn't do any of that. He keeps it all in.
Mm-hmm. I also think, and then I'll call on Rabbi Pernick, but I also think that what we're seeing in this episode is that different people deal with grief differently. And even within the same family, I have 3 other siblings, and all of my brothers and each one of us deal with things very differently, including grief. And so I think what we're seeing in this kind of new character role of Nati's is that he is recognizing the ways in which he needs to grieve, the ways in which he felt connected to his mother, and hearing other people relate to her and to relate to those moments differently is hard for him. And I think that's true in all family dynamics, right? It's not just Nati as a character. I think it's true in anybody's dynamic of how you deal with a loved one dying and what you do next and how you stay connected if you can as a family. Rabbi Pernick.
So I guess 2 things. So when my dad died back in 1997, and it was very sudden. So that was my first real experience with Shiva, as a mourner. And I came to realize that the point of Shiva, and why I try to encourage my people to sit as full of Shiva as possible, because they have it in their heads that you're only supposed to do 3 days. It's kind of like, it's an alternate reform halacha. It's like, no, you can do 7. It's okay. But I think the point of Shiva, which I think I saw with Nati and the rolling his eyes, is to get sick and tired of Shiva. Mm-hmm. And so you can't stand it. I've told this story 50 times. We've done this over and over. And let's get on with life already. To me, that's precisely the point. So for him, yeah, I mean, I think there's some sibling rivalry there and, who knows, whatever else. But everybody who comes to the mourner is hearing it fresh. Mm. And to me, that's what I always tell people. Just, you're getting tired of it. Good. That's, because a lot of people, they want to I can only do a 1-day Shiva. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you're not psychologically getting to the point. On a somewhat different note, I just wanted to add, with the whole Hamakom Yenachem thing, which is always awkward, and I love the way they dealt with it. But I think also part of the reason for that is that people are very uncomfortable around death. Yeah. And they don't know what to say. And I had heard this before my dad died. Now I tell everybody because it happened at my dad, the Shiva for my dad. Some, I'm really, they don't know what to say. And somebody, and I'm sure other people here have had this experience. Somebody says something really, really stupid. I mean, just like really, where you just like want to look at the person and say, what do you say? Because they're stumbling. They just don't know what to say. And if you give people a formula, at least
just trust it was in God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah, no, good point. Okay, I have to hop off because I have a religious committee meeting right now. But Rabbi Schatz is a host, so I'm just gonna hop off and.
But you have to make me the host then.
Yeah. Okay.
Wait, but is there a religious committee meeting in your Zoom? Because then we're gonna.
Oh. No, different.
See you later. I'll take this with the other Rabbi Pernick. We got it. Okay. Okay, Barbara.
Just to extend on what Rabbi Pernick just mentioned, which I agree with him completely. I had no idea about what it was going to be like to be a mourner until my father actually died. Having the Shiva last the 7 days, and we come from, in San Francisco, being conservative was really like being reformed down in LA practically. But it's to extend it a little further, saying Kaddish for the year. I didn't realize until the year was up how much it had helped me to get over the loss of my father. My father was, no question, my favorite parent. He was a doctor. I followed after him in his steps. He and I were able to converse my entire life better than I did with my mom, but I became really close with my mom after my dad died. And I was friendly. I won't say I wasn't close with my mom, but the comparison. But I found that the extension of saying Kaddish for that year, wow, it sure did help. It extended the period of time that it takes for you to get over that loss, because the loss of a parent, or if you're older, and I have not suffered this, a loss of a kid is a horrible thing.
Yeah.
I would just advise people to advise their friends if they ever come across this. It's a great way to get over the loss of someone you're close to.
Yeah. I've shared this a few times before, but I'll say it again. There are many things that I disagree with in terms of ritual practice and observance and all those things in our tradition. Many things that I have no control over, and some things that I do have control over that I'm not sure what the rabbis were thinking. But when it comes to death, and actually when it comes to marriage, and just the ways in which those are two moments that you don't necessarily know what you're supposed to do, or where am I supposed to stand, or what am I supposed to say to make sure that my person knows that I love them when I hand them that ring, right? Our rabbis created something for us, whether it's a timeline like we have with death, or it's ritual like we have with a wedding, that really do create that formula for you, like you're talking about, Barbara, that allows a person to know not only what to say, but what to do, and how to allow the other people around you to also know what to do and what to say. My dad, the first person that was very close to me who passed away was my dad's mom. And I was in 10th grade, so I kind of knew what was going on, but had never lost a grandparent. Still, the rest of my grandparents are still alive, thank God. And I remember my dad saying Kaddish for the entire year. And when we asked him why he felt like he should do that, he said that it gave him a moment every day to think of his mom. He didn't care what the words were. He didn't care that he was standing in a particular sanctuary. In fact, he found some of his least favorite communities to say Kaddish in. But it gave him a moment to think of his mom. And he used to always talk about how he would imagine his mom sitting next to God, and that was how he was able to say Kaddish. And so whatever it is for people to be able to have those moments of checking in, or those moments of Shiva where you have people come to your home to surround you in a time where you just don't expect anybody to care because you're at the lowest of the lows, that's when our rabbis stepped up and said, look what we can create for you so that you still have that around you and you have those moments. And I think that's amazing. I think that our tradition, our religion did a really great job there. Okay, we're gonna close. The last thing that I will just share about this episode that I think will be brought up again, which is why Rabbi Pernick and I didn't choose to bring it up as a whole topic today, is this idea of Hodaya still kind of having one foot in one door and one foot in the other door, and not knowing how to disconnect from her family and yet be able to move on with a different kind of life. And we all know people who have moved in those two different directions, either become more become more, quote, religious, or less, and how that can take you away in certain ways from your family unless you figure out ways to still stay connected. And Hodaya is in that limbo, right, to bring that word back even to this experience of not really knowing how to have those connections and still be her own person. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as the episodes move on. So I was just reading the piece from Rachel, and have a great night and great week.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.